Where'd you go? You disappeared. There you are. Before we start, you can do anything you want with mugs. So feel free.
Yes, thank you, sir. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My guest today is an incredible man, Scott Ritter. Hello, Mr. Ritter. Glad to see you. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thanks. Good to see you again.
Today I plan to conduct an interview without touching on military and political topics. You are asked the same question everywhere. But this is important news. Let's start with it quickly and short. What do you think is happening in Kherson? Many people in Russia are discouraged by the news and do not understand much, absolutely don't understand. Kherson is part of Russia, according to the constitution, and it's now beyond abandoned. This is strange. What do you think about this situation?
Well, I think that when General Surovikin was appointed commander back, I believe, on October 14th, around that time, he said the situation in Kherson was very tense. It was so tense, in fact, that he ordered the evacuation of all civilians from the west bank of the Dnieper River, including the city of Kherson itself. Ask yourself why he did that. Did he do it because he's a loser? Did he do it because he's a coward? Did he do it because he's a traitor to Russia? Obviously, he hates Russia. Obviously, he's a traitor. He's in the employ of Ukraine and the Americans because he's surrendering Russian territory. It's Mother Russia, after all. It's worth everything. Everything it's worth, not a damn thing till the war is over. Right now, it's just a piece of territory. General Surovikin has important things to worry about, like winning a war. And I don't think he's willing to sacrifice either 200,000 new Russian citizens, by the way, or 30,000 Russian troops, because people who have no say whatsoever in what's going on in the battlefield, think about it for a second. You know, back in World War II, how did people learn about the war? They listened to somebody tell them about it on the radio. And they had a map on their wall, and they could plot the forces, and they could see things going, and they could sit back and analyze it and say, okay, I see what's happening here. Today, we have the internet, 24-hour news cycle. We're all instant experts on everything. And, you know, we decide this is a bad move. Why? Because we feel it's bad. Ask yourself how many of the people who are criticizing General Surovikin and the other Russian leaders have the burden of command on their shoulders. Are they personally responsible for the lives of the civilians and the Russian soldiers? Are they the ones that have to write a letter home to the mothers, the wives, the daughters about why their son died in battle? No, they're keyboard heroes. They're the most despicable kind of heroes, people who are thousands of miles distant from the battlefield, and yet they write as if they themselves have won 2 or 3 golden stars, because, of course, they're geniuses. If they were geniuses, they'd be the generals in charge. They're not. The people in charge have a higher responsibility than making keyboard heroes feel good about themselves. Grow up, people. This is war. The general inherited an incredibly difficult situation, one where Russia, for whatever reason, and at some point in time, Russian leadership should have to explain itself, had only 200,000 men allocated. Nice cup. 200 things. I'm going to match it just a second. I can say, ask me about my book, you see, and then I can turn it in, and there's my book. So I'll see your mug, and I match you with my own mug. But but the point is, there weren't sufficient troops. This is why Russia had to go through a partial mobilization, 300,000 troops. I think there was between 80 and 100,000 volunteers who also enlisted during this time, an incredible display of patriotism. But it takes time for these troops to be trained, equipped, and there's some hiccups. Apparently there was corruption in Russia. Oh no, we're not allowed to talk about that. But apparently there was some corruption. Apparently uniforms that should have been stocked have been sold on the black market. People had enriched themselves. Not everywhere actually in most of the recruiting centers, things worked very well. People came, received their equipment, were sent off for training in a very organized fashion. It's only in a minority of places where this corruption was identified and it was corrected. So I think the Russians did pretty good getting these 300,000, but it takes time. And remember, time isn't something General Surovikin has control of. He inherited a tense situation. What does that mean? On the West Bank, he has 30,000 troops. Confronting him are around 70,000 Ukrainian troops who are heavily armed and equipped by NATO. These troops are attacking. The Russians are doing pretty good. In fact, in the month of October, we're told, about 12,000 of these Ukrainians were either killed or wounded. The Russians suffered too, 1,300 to 1,500 troops killed or wounded. That's a lot. But they're winning the battle. Anybody who sits there and says the Russians can't fight, oh my God, the Russians are killing the Ukrainians in large numbers. The question now is that sustainable? On the West Bank, if you think about it, take our Ukrainian artillery. Let's say hypothetically it has a range of 10 kilometers. I know it has more than that, but we're going to use 10 kilometers. To hit a Russian position 1 kilometer into the front line, the Ukrainian artillery has to come within 9 kilometers of the front line. Now they fire and they hit the Russian position. Now, normally the Russians could bring artillery up and fire back and hit the Ukrainian artillery. And because the Russians have artillery superiority, they'll win that artillery duel. However, the Ukrainians aren't just hitting artillery, they're hitting the bridges, they're hitting the command and control, they're hitting the logistics of a 30,000 man force on the west bank of the Dnieper, which is now isolated. It's difficult to supply these guys. So now for the Russians to bring their artillery up to do this artillery duel, they use things called ammunition. I know these keyboard heroes don't like to think about this, but ammunition actually has to be brought into the battlefield, along with fuel, food, everything needed to sustain war. And it has to be brought in every day. The moment you have a hiccup and you don't bring it in, the guys don't get to fight because they don't have ammunition now. So now the Russian artillery comes in, but they don't have sufficient ammunition. They can't do what they're supposed to do. So now they're at a disadvantage. In order for them to fight, they have to pull back behind the river, the Dnieper River, on the east bank. But now they're far removed. So now the Ukrainian artillery gets to come up and pound the Russian soldiers without the ability for the Russian soldiers to respond sufficiently. And when the Russian soldiers bring in their artillery, they're at a disadvantage now. They're losing more pieces. So now you're the general looking at this saying, my boys are fighting heroically. They're doing a great job. We're killing more of them than they're killing us. But is this really the fight I want to fight? Is this worth the loss of Russian life to defend some dirt on the west bank of the Dnieper River? Why don't I do the responsible thing? Now that I've preserved civilian life, why don't I preserve Russian military life? Why don't I bring them back over to the river? And you know, if you ever look at the Dnieper River, the west bank is actually a little bit lower than the east bank. Now the Russians have a hike advantage, so their artillery goes further. So now you bring everybody back to the bank and you tell the Ukrainians, come on, boys, come to daddy. And the daddy's going to blow them up and kill them. This ain't a Ukrainian victory. This is the Russians doing the smart thing while they're awaiting the arrival of the 300,000. Remember, only 80,000 troops have arrived in the Special Military Operations Zone. Only 80,000. And these were used to reinforce those gaps. Remember, the tense situation is because there wasn't enough men. And the Russians had a defensive line that had giant holes in it. So they brought in 80,000 troops and they filled up those holes. But sometimes when you have all this territory you're defending, maybe it's best to bring your troops back and consolidate them so you have a stronger defensive line. Wow, those Russian generals, maybe they're not traitors at all. Maybe they actually know what the hell they're doing. So here they are, consolidating defensive lines, getting a stronger position so they can kill Ukrainians more efficiently. And guess what? There's still 200,000 Russian troops being trained. Right now, as we speak, 200,000. They're not there yet. They're not on the battlefield yet. Ukrainians, they don't have 200,000 troops being trained. They might have 40 or 50,000 troops being trained, but it's going to take a couple months for them to get there. Troops they did have being trained are being killed on the front line by the Russians. And I guarantee you this, once Russia completes its withdrawal from Kherson to the other side of the river, they're going to kill the Ukrainians in even larger numbers. The casualty disparity is going to blow your mind. So how is this bad? Oh, yeah, I forgot. We surrendered a Russian city. Hey, you know, it's war, guys. You don't always get what you want. I mean, the Rolling Stones wrote a song about that. You can't always get what you want. But if you try sometimes, you just might find you get what you need. And that's what the Russians are trying to do right now. Consolidate the defense, preserve Russian life. If I were a Russian mom, wife, or daughter, or a son, an uncle, a grandfather, anybody, I would be thanking this general for saving the lives of my troops because it's not dishonorable to live. And these troops aren't running away. These guys already proved that they're man enough to kill the Ukrainians in close combat. They're just not dumb enough to sit there when the Ukrainians have an advantage brought on by a territorial accident. Let's correct the mistake. Then let's wait for those 200,000 Russian troops to come. And I have a funny feeling when they do come, it's going to be a little bit different situation. You see, the Russians now will not only be able to defend, but they'll be able to attack. And they might even attack in a way that what? Recaptures Kherson in a manner which destroys the Ukrainian army? I don't know. Call me silly, call me naive, call me whatever you want. But I have no problem with what the Russian leadership has done with Kherson. I view it as the most responsible kind of leadership imaginable.
Mm-hmm. We will see. I will agree with you. This is real war, not computer game, not internet war. It's a real war. My next questions will not concern military topics. By the way, you can answer as much as you want. There are no time limits. I don't have a whip for you. I don't have a whip for you.
I'll tell Jeff.
Yes, many people who listen to you may think you don't like the USA. Maybe you hate USA. But I know this is absolutely not the case. I want to ask you now to name 3, 4, 5 or more things that you love in the USA. Something to be proud of USA. Before you answer, I want to say what I like about the USA. I really appreciate and love Americans' novels, especially the 20th century. I appreciate as well as Russian classics, especially Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged is my favorite books. I love Francis Scott Fitzgerald, Theodore Dreiser, Daniel Keyes, Jerome de Salinger, Jack London, and other books. I also love American classic movie. City Lights with Charlie Chaplin, Citizen Kane, Psycho, Casablanca. And I also like biography, Americans' great men, Benjamin Franklin, great American businessmen, J.P. Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt, John Rockefeller, Henry Ford, Andrew Carnegie. This is important because, as Dostoevsky wrote, this is not only good or only bad. It's important to see different sides in people, different sides on country. Please name the things you love in the USA and tell us in detail about them.
Well, first and foremost, what I love about the United States is the promise of America, potential.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically enshrined in the Constitution of the United States. And the important thing people need to know about the Constitution is that it recognizes from its very inception that it's imperfect. It's not an absolute. That's why we can amend it. In fact, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, are a reflection of the fact that the founding fathers sort of made a mistake when they wrote the Constitution. That, oops, there's things that we have to talk about, like freedom of speech and all the protections that are accrued with American citizenship. So the Constitution, and the sad thing about the Constitution is that not too many people know about it. I mean, we know it exists, but very few people have actually read it and tried to understand it. And many of those who do don't understand that it's a living document. that it is designed to be altered based upon the maturity of a nation. As America grows and becomes different than what it was in the past, the Constitution and how the Constitution is interpreted. I mean, we have a Supreme Court. That's something I'm not too happy about, but the Supreme Court, at least in theory, allows the Constitution to be interpreted through the lens of modern society, and that therefore we're not trapped to something that was decided 100 years ago. We can change, we can alter in a manner that best reflects the needs and wants of the people. But it's from the Constitution that everything else I love about America comes from. I love the fact that I get to say anything I want, pretty much. I mean, I can't jump up in a movie theater and shout fire. That's criminal, rightly so too. But I get to hold any opinion I want. And I get to hold that opinion strongly. And I'm not a prisoner to your facts. Fact is, I'm not a prisoner to any facts. It'd be nice if I were. I mean, that would be ideal. But the fact is, I get to wake up in the morning and decide the sky is purple, even though it's not. But I get to go out and say the sky is purple, and nobody can stop me because I get to say anything I want. Now, I don't like the abuses that free speech. I mean, I get a little, just like everybody else. Sometimes I prefer people would just shut up. The free speech hurts your ears sometimes. But the point is, it's their right. It's their right. And then the other thing that's attached to free speech is freedom of assembly. I get to meet anybody I want to, virtually anywhere I want to exercise free speech. And my free speech, I get to do something really cool. I get to hold those I elect to higher office accountable for what they do in my name. They don't get to shut me up. I get to speak about, I can criticize them, and I don't have to worry about jackbooted thugs kicking down my door and dragging me out and torturing me. Generally speaking, I mean, it's not a perfect system. Remember, America's not a perfect country. That's what we need to understand straight up. It's not perfect. What I love about America is not its perfection, it's potential, the potential to do good. And so the next thing that there is the people. What I love about America is the people. I mean, we are literally some of the most misunderstood people in the world because a lot of people identify America through the lens of the government, how we interact with the world. But I think most people who study global affairs understand that the American government isn't necessarily a reflection of the American people, but of a combination of special interests that are more aligned towards corporate identities than the identities of the American people. The American people, truly speaking, suffer as much from governmental abuse as the rest of the world does. I mean, it's not like the government takes care of us. So that's why we get to hold them to account. But despite all of the imperfections of our government, the American people are fundamentally good people. I mean, just like anybody else, we have our problems. And I know there's people out there. I know in Russia, for instance, Russia, looks at us and says, they say, "Oh my God, you're a racist society." Yeah, we are. I mean, we don't want to be. Some people want to be, but generally speaking, we don't want to be. We're working on that. But yeah, I acknowledge that. You give homosexuals rights. Sure, we do. They're citizens. See, the beauty of being an American is that everybody has rights to be who they want. I know other cultures. I'm not saying that Russia's wrong on what's good for Russia. That's Russia's business. In America, our business is people, and people have rights. Some things confuse me. I'll be the first person to say that I don't understand the whole transgender thing. I understand homosexuality. It's been around forever. And you say, okay, I don't like it, but I understand it. It's there, and they have a right to exist. Transgendered, I have to say, I don't understand it. It does have a right to exist, but I can't sit here and say I know exactly what's going on. I don't know. I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to have an open mind, but there's some things that just confuse me, and I don't understand the allure. I don't understand this, that, and the other thing. But you know what? I live in America, so my responsibility as a citizen, in addition to insisting on my right to speak freely and live freely, is to respect the right of others to do so as well. as long as, I don't impose myself on them, they don't impose themselves on me, and we learn to live in blissful harmony. It's an ideal. It isn't happening, as you know. Anybody who knows that there's significant problems in America that are derived from, cultural clashes over homosexuality, transgender identity, et cetera, et cetera. But we're working on it. We're working on it. That's the important thing. We're working on it. And from the people comes everything. I'm a huge fan of history.
Mm-hmm.
And I love American history. Now, people are going to say, how could you love the white man slaughtering the Indians? How could you love the white man enslaving the African American? How could you love men abusing women? I don't. I love the story. I love the story. I love the history of this imperfect nation filled with imperfect people trying to come together in an imperfect manner to create something that could be, in theory, a bright, shining city on the hill, but it isn't. It's got its ghettos. It's got its pollution. It's got its problems, but it's there. And I love the history of it. I love studying the history, the good, the bad, the ugly. It all comes together in this great story of how America became American. I know people are going to be, it's about manifest destiny going across. Yeah, it is. But you know what? Before you criticize manifest destiny, put yourself in the wagon of an immigrant moving from the east to the west across the prairies and the human story of that. Put yourself, in the community of the American Indians, the Native Americans, who had to see these wagon trains coming and the clash of cultures that took place. Study it from both sides. See it, not as judging who's right and who's wrong, the story, just the story of what happened. It's a huge, gigantic human story. And from that, you learn a lot about people. You learn about what's good about people, what's bad about people, and you learn about the heart and soul of people, how they can overcome problems. And that's the American story. The history of America is about people overcoming problems. Not perfectly, imperfectly, but overcoming problems nonetheless to create this nation that we have here. And when you study the history of America, it's not just the story, but it's the landscape. This is a beautiful country. I mean, I know other countries are beautiful. I travel around the world and it's there. But America brings a unique beauty, just like everybody does. I mean, Russia has a unique beauty. China has a unique beauty. India has a unique beauty. America has a unique beauty, and I love it because it's mine. It's my country, from sea to shining sea. I've traveled from the Atlantic to the Pacific. I've seen all that's in between. Not all, there's still things I need to see. I want to see. Big country. I've been around 61 years, and I haven't seen it all. But I've seen enough to know that I love this country. I love what we stand for, our potential. I love the people. I love the beauty of this, and I want to preserve it. I want to preserve this country because I do believe that ultimately American people will try to be on the right side of history. We're not always, and we aren't today on many things, but ultimately I know the soul of the American people, and I know we want to be on the right side of history. And so I'll say this, anybody who thinks I don't love my country, attack my country. You'll find how much I love my country. I love my country enough to give my life for my country. I will give my life in defense of my country. An interesting thing about being an American is I get to be critical of my country. That's my duty. That's my responsibility as a citizen. A good citizen isn't somebody who just sits there and goes, yay, yay, everything. A good citizen is someone who says, no, you're doing it wrong. Fix it. Do it this way. I don't like what you're doing. Do this right. That's what good people do. When good people see problems, they step up and they say, I need you to fix it. Some people misconstrue that into saying, well, you're critical of American government, therefore you must hate your country. Oh, no. I'm critical of the American government because I love my country, because I have a vision for what I want my country to be, and my government isn't necessarily doing that which I want them. And remember, it's government of the people, by the people, for the people. It ain't government for the sake of government. When I joined the military, I didn't raise my hand and swear an oath and allegiance to the government. swore to the Constitution, to we the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union. I mean, so, it's, and the other thing I'd say is that just like I can't tell you that I understand fully what makes a Russian a Russian. I mean, I think I do. I've studied it. But I mean, ultimately, the Russian soul is something I only know from an abstract perspective. I'm here to tell you right now that the American soul is as equally complex, and that the people who criticize America today don't understand Americans. And I have no problem with people criticizing my government. I do it. But I do have a problem when people turn their dissatisfaction with the American government into some sort of hatred for the American people. You're wrong to do that. You're wrong, just like we're wrong to do it to anybody else. It shows a level of ignorance, and it's unbecoming of anybody. But no, I think I answered the question. I love, you talked about art. Everything you talked about. I mean, do I love American cinema? I love some parts. There's some parts I don't. I mean, I think sometimes American culture is very superficial. But I love movies when they tell a story, because I love the American story. I love novels that tell a story. I grew up on Louis L'Amour, Western writer. Just the story of the American West told through his eyes. Was it fiction? Yeah. Was it? Did it have any semblance to reality? Probably not. But it was a story. It was a fun story to read. I enjoy the fictionalized aspects of America because it makes you feel good. I mean, America's work. America's hard work. And hard work wears you out. It wears you down. So sometimes it's okay to unplug from reality, plug into fiction, a story, a movie, a book, something that makes you feel good. So long as at the end of the day, when you unplug, you understand that that wasn't real. That was a story. It just makes you feel good. But now you have to plug back into reality and work. And maybe what you're trying to work is to make life like the story you just watched. Make it resemble something that made you happy. So maybe that's what motivates you in that direction. So I'm not as well-read as you. Look, I'm a Marine, so I can't sit here and pretend that I'm some sort of a esteemed scholar of English fiction and that I've read all the French novels and I know Dostoevsky intimately. I read them, but I don't know them intimately. But I do my best. And I think most Americans are like me. We're good-hearted people. We are intellectually curious. And we want something better than what we're currently getting. And we're working toward that objective.
Yes. Thank you. You talk about the U.S. Constitution. At university, I studied the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. But to be honest, I wasn't impressed. Most likely, I was a bad student. It's interesting. I wrote my personal constitution, and I used the U.S. Constitution as a model, a basis. In my personal constitution, for example, there are also 7 articles, and I wrote that main goal is to achieve happiness and general well-being for myself and my family. If I remember correctly, there is something similar about general welfare and happiness in the U.S. Constitution. It's interesting. My next question.
Can I just say something real quick about that? When you wrote your Constitution, how many people did you have to get to agree with you before you finalized your Constitution? Just you. Now imagine, if you would, trying to write a Constitution that has to be passed by 13 colonies, all of which have unique identities, unique economic requirements, unique political requirements, etc., and some which don't like the other. The guys down the south don't like the guys in the north. The guys in the north don't like the guys in the south. But we bring them together, and we have to have a constitutional convention where the words that are going to be put down are binding on everybody. Imagine trying to get these high-minded ideals put into a document where you have 13 vetoes, and you have to overcome just one state, one colony saying no. That's the end of it. The American Constitution is a beautiful document when you understand the history of its formation, because it was done in a very contentious fashion. But we also had the the benefit of experiencing the Articles of Confederation. You see, when we were first formed, we didn't have a constitution. We weren't a republic. We were a confederacy. And we had the Articles of Confederation, and it just didn't work. And so the 13 colonies went, well, that didn't work. We need to come up with something different, maybe a republic with a powerful executive. How do we do that? Okay, we'll write the Constitution. And they finally came up with it. Read the Federalist Papers. I mean, the debates that went on. I mean, that's what makes the Constitution. We get into history again. The Constitution isn't just the document. It's the history of the making of the document. In fact, if you go to the Supreme Court, you look in their decisions, they oftentimes look at the Constitution and say, well, I wonder what they were thinking when they wrote that. Well, we know because there's the Federalist Papers where they argued it out. They wrote letters back and forth. And you get the whole notion of what the founding fathers believed in, what they wanted, and they weren't always on the same sheet of paper. I mean, you look at Jefferson and Madison going at it, they disagreed, but they worked out a compromise. So the Constitution was a compromise. And again, it was a compromise that was cobbled together in the late 18th century. And that's why we have to have amendments, because the social, economic, and political reality of that time does not match the social, economic, political reality of today. We have to grow. That's what I love about the Constitution. I love its history. I love the fact that it can evolve. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. It's I am bad student in university. My next question.
You didn't play football and drink beer, so yeah.
My next question: you could name the top 5 of your favorite books. Maybe novels, maybe something scientific, maybe something for the psychologically of self-development. Your top 5 favorite books.
Well, the thing is, somebody asked me that question on the internet once, and I put some books down, and I better be able to match. Look, one of my favorite books is Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy. I told you I love Jean Le Carré. That's a good book.
Good book, that.
You might want to ask me about my book. Which one? Oh, yeah. Look, we'll put my books aside. Although I think Disarming the Time of Perestroika is a great book. And I really mean that. The more I read it after writing it, the more I realize I did a good job, that I accomplished what I was setting out. Some books you write, and afterwards you read it going, I could have done a better job. I should have said this. This one I look at and I say, I think I did a perfect job. But, I was an intelligence officer. So, a large part of my life deals with the world of intelligence and what's involved in that. It's not as sexy as being an infantryman, A lot of great movies are made about, infantrymen, because they get to be in the ship, rocking in the boat, the ramp goes down, people dying, blowing up, they're going, killing people and all that stuff. But behind them, there's an intelligence officer who sits at a desk and does this. Try and write a book about this, ready? Can't. Not physically. You have to write about what's going on between this earlobe and this earlobe. The mental games, the head games. And I think Jean Le Carré, a former British MI6 operative, accurately captures that, the intellectual aspect of espionage, of intelligence, spy versus spy, the brain games, the emotional games, etc. And Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy is one of the best books. Spy Who Came in from the Cold is another one of my all-time favorite books. I'm a military guy, and there's just contradictions in the military, inherent. Let's just start off that. Hi, we're good people, but we kill people. You can't be a good person if you kill people. Well, we only kill people in a just cause. Well, who determines what a just cause is? What's the morality of war? Things like that. So, Once an Eagle is a book that I absolutely love. It follows the career of two officers through the United States Army, not the Marines, the Army. But what the heck is? Every book has its feelings. But you follow it, and you just see this question of war and the morality of war. How can you be a moral combatant? Well, you look at this and you see how this guy operates. The main character, Sam Damon, I believe his name is, how he operates, how he grows as a leader, and compared to his opposite number. And it's one of the great books of leadership. and command responsibility and things of that nature. A really, really good book. Another great book is written by a former Marine and former Navy Secretary, James Webb, called Fields of Fire. It's a book about Vietnam, but it's also a book about leadership and responsibility and what war does to people. You know, how it chews you up, eats you up, changes you. So I think that's another book that would strongly encourage people to read. I just read a book a little while ago that it's become one of my favorites. In All the Light You Cannot See, I think is the name of the book. It's about a blind French girl during World War II, and I don't want to spoil it for people, but it's just a fascinating book, seeing war through the eyes of a blind girl, and having her describe how sound of war and the sound of voices and all this stuff. Just a really, really solid book. Another one of my favorite writers is a guy named Leon Uris. And he wrote a number of books. QB7, Queen Bench 7. He wrote a great book called Armageddon, one of my all-time favorite books about the Berlin airlift. A classic book. But maybe my most favorite book of his is Trinity, and it's about the Irish experience and the tragedy of Ireland. And it's just a fantastic book. And I know people are out there going to say, well, what about Russia? Where's your Russian book? And I do have one. I think, Sholikov, the Quiet Dawn, is just I read that book and I read it again and I read it again and I read it again. And each time I read it, there was just different nuances. I thought I knew the story when I first read it, but then I read it again and I said, I don't know the story at all. And I had to read it a third time. And then every time I thought I know it, I just finished it. I read it over the course of the summer because I just said, I'm going to go back and read that book. I did, and I learned something new. Again, just different, the portraits of people that the author puts out there. But we could go on all day. I read a lot, and I think everything I just gave you was all fiction. But I do love history. Solid histories, and one of the best histories that I've read is the trilogy written by a guy named Rick Atkinson. It's basically about the U.S. Army in World War II. 3 books, I think. It's An Army at Dawn. I got them right here. Army at Dawn, Day of Battle, and Guns at Last Light. Basically, it follows the North African campaign, the Italian campaign, and then the battle for Europe. And right now there's a lot of online debate, I guess, about who won World War II. And the Russians rightfully say, hey, we lost 27 million people. We fought 60% of the German army. We won. And I agree. I'm not disagreeing. That's why on my bookshelf you'll see a history, 2 histories written by John Erickson, The Road to Stalingrad and The Road to Berlin. It discusses the Russian side of the war. There's a autobiography of Zhukov, or a biography of Zhukov up there. I'm very well read on the Eastern Front. I'll tell you what, I'm better well read on the Eastern Front than most Russians are about the American side of it. You don't know anything about it. You belittle it. You waited until the last minute. You waited until we defeated them to come in. Read the books, and you'll see that's not the truth at all, not even close to the truth. Yes, we didn't have quite the scope and scale of the Eastern Front. That was unique. You can't, I'm not going to put it down. I'm not going to put it away. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. It happened. It's there. But we happened too. And the other thing you have to understand is that while we were fighting on the European front, and it was a major fight of wills. It's not just about the battles. How many allies did Russia have to deal with on the Eastern Front? Stalin said, do it, do it, do it, do it. His general said, do it. We had to work with the British. Try working with the British. It's very difficult. Try working with the French. It's impossible. Try working with anybody else. America had to build this coalition, and the history of how we made that work the Battle of Egos. I mean, Patton versus Montgomery. Come on, if there wasn't Bradley, we might end up going to war against the British. And then at the same time, we had Pacific War, which is largely misunderstood by the Russian people. You don't have a clue what happened in the Pacific. And the Pacific War isn't just about the battles on the ground, but the battles at sea. The battles at sea require ships to be built, and we built a whole bunch of ships, and then these massive naval battles, and then the logistics. Because if you're going to put 20,000 Marines onto Iwo Jima, a little island in the middle of the Pacific, you got to supply them, and that means a constant stream of ships. Who built the ships? We built the ships. The same stream of ships, by the way, that were sailing into Murmansk and Archangel and providing Lend-Lease equipment to the Soviet Union. The same ships that sailed down in the south to Bandar Abbas and brought equipment up through Iran. So the United States did a lot in that war, but I think it's really misunderstood. But when you study, the thing I like about Rick Atkinson's trilogy is it describes the transition. And I think people should read the books just to understand this. The American military at the beginning of World War II was a draft military, conscripts. Most of them didn't want to join. They were like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to farm. I want to stay home. We were an isolationist country. So we draft these guys. And then after Pearl Harbor, we get a lot of volunteers, but still a lot of draftees. We had to train them. How do you train guys? Training an American soldier is difficult, because first of all, we're not very good at discipline. The Americans don't like discipline. We're free. We have freedom of speech, by the way, and we like to remind the sergeants and the lieutenants and the captains that we have freedom of speech, and they can't totally suppress that, or else it's an army that doesn't work. So there had to be a compromise. So we had this unique army of malcontents, guys who didn't want to be there, sometimes didn't understand why we're going there. I mean, the Japanese bombed us in Pearl Harbor. Why am I going to North Africa? What do you want? And then we had these officers who, many of them were martinets. Remember Once an Eagle? I talked about that book. Well, you get to see it in real life. These officers who are leading men, but they don't know how to lead. They put on paper, but not in reality. And our first battle we lost, the big Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. We got our butts handed to us by the Germans. They embarrassed us. But we learned from that battle. And the thing about Kasserine Pass is what I said is that we learned what it meant to lose, and we learned what it meant to die, and we didn't like it. And suddenly you see this transformation take place, where this band of amateurs, malcontents, suddenly realizes they have to kill. The only way they're going to go home is to kill the enemy. And then they learn that they like it. They like killing. They learn that they're good at killing. And you look at this transformation so that by the time the war ends in 1945, we have an army of killers, hardcore killers, unbeatable, by the way. I know people, the Russians could beat you. You weren't going to beat us. Our army hadn't suffered the casualties you had suffered. Our industry was just kicking up. Your industry was in disarray. Thank God we never had to go to war because it would have been tragedy on both sides. But we had this army that was just unbeatable, huge, massive, composed of people that enjoyed killing Germans, just like we enjoyed killing Japanese in the Pacific. We enjoyed it. But then the big story is how we dismantled this army, brought these guys back home, and then how we absorbed them, reabsorbed them into society. And again, we didn't do it perfectly, but we did it with, for instance, the GI Bill. And the other part of the story is these guys that started the war came out of the Great Depression, one of the greatest economic tragedies, social tragedies in America, the Great Depression. We were ruined as a nation. We had to rebuild. And many of these guys served in the Civilian Conservation Corps. They helped build the bridges and the dams and the roads. But now they come in, they join the military. The United States that emerged from World War II was far different than the United States that started World War II. We were now an industrial superpower with massive industrial capability that the world was looking to. And we absorbed these guys. We took these farm boys, they came home from the war, and we gave them a college education. And then they got integrated into the American dream for all of its flaws. But But the idea is that we took these killers and retrained them to be civilians, be citizens. And they did a good job. They did a really good job. They paid a heavy price, just like in the Soviet, I'm sure, your Russian veterans didn't come home and go to the bar and brag about how great it was at Stalingrad. They didn't talk about it because it wasn't great at Stalingrad. It wasn't great at any time. The only people they could really talk to were the guys they fought with. And even then, they talked about the things that didn't involve dying. They talked about that time when we were marching and that rabbit went across and we saw the cow do this and we laughed about it and all that. But they don't talk about the time that Boris took a bullet in the head and Ivan and Semyon got blown up by the mine and how they held their dying friend. They don't talk about that because nobody wants to talk about that. It's the same thing with the Americans. They came back and they put it inside them. They buried it and they moved on. And it's important for society to understand that transition because the scars that war leave on a society infect that society forever. And we were a different country that emerged. You probably saw my eyes sparkle when I talked about how the military was killers, but it's not sparkling out of that it's something I really want. Just a statement of reality. You have to appreciate it that these guys became hardcore, stone cold killers. That's not a good thing. I mean, it's good in war. Don't be on the other. Don't do that. And it takes a lot to turn Americans to killers because we're not raised to be killers. But when you go through that crucible, you become a killer. And then you have to become a citizen. And that transition defined who we are going forward. And it may be the explanation of why we are what we are today. This aggressive force that's in the world today. It's because we took 12 million killers, we put them back into society, and we didn't give them an outlet to explain the complexity of thought and emotions that they were going through. So instead, they became civilians, but civilians who were tolerant of the necessity to kill, to get American foreign policy implemented. And I think that colored who we are as a nation. And maybe that's something that we need to aspire to be. Less people like me who train to kill, and more people like the average American citizen who doesn't want to kill. They're the ones that maybe should be taking the lead. But unfortunately, the way our society works is it's people like me, because I have the experience now, the real world experience, that get the jobs, they get to influence things. And the other people, they're called naive, they're called childlike in their approach, and they're pushed to the side. Anyways, that's a long rambling answer. I need the whip.
Yeah. I'm surprised. Why not 50 Shades of Grey? I joke. I love the story. I love this.
Why would I ever subject somebody to that? I don't know.
I love the story of Desmond Doss in American war history. Desmond Doss, he's really hero to me. It's fantastic history for me. My next question, it's a long question. I know that you have been listening to Vladimir Putin's speeches for many years. I know another person who does this. This is Professor Jordan Peterson. And Jordan Peterson made a video where he named 4 reasons for this conflict. And he called the culture war one of the reasons for the conflict. According to Peterson, Vladimir Putin sometimes talk about it, sees himself and Russia as an opponent of the culture of wokeism in the West. Traditional values, family, religion, Orthodox Christianity, gender separation, against parent number 1, parent number 2, various pronouns, more than 2 genders, atheism, and other things. And it turns out that there not only war on earth, not political war, not and economic war, but also a culture war. This is war not Russia against the collective West, but according to Peterson, a civil war in the West itself. Do you think there is any truth in this? And does Putin have such in his head? But before you answer, I will add from myself. I look Saudi Arabia, and it seems to me that this is the reason why they turned away from United States. it is Muslim country, and it seems to me then when they look at the United States and left liberal politics and are like, oh no no no, it's not want we at home, it's for me. What do you think about this?
Well, I'll just say this about the Saudis. I've seen them in London, and the concept that the Saudis are like, oh no no no, we don't want that. Go to London, watch how they behave in London, and they're free of the constraints. And then come back and tell me they don't like the West. So they, anyways, let's put Saudi Arabia aside because I think there's some larger economic reasons, such as America exploiting Saudi oil production for the benefit of America, as opposed to the benefit of the Saudi people that might have contributed to that. I mean, we'll put Mr. Peterson aside for a second because I'm familiar with him, but I can't pretend that I watch his videos and just talk about the Russian president for a second. I've read his speeches, and my understanding is that first of all, in order for there to be a clash of cultures or a clash of civilizations, it means that both sides are trying to change the other. Now, there are some in the United States, of course, who believe that America should be exporting its culture because that's a reflection of our values, and we're a values-driven foreign policy and all this kind of stuff. I don't think Vladimir Putin is trying to export Russian beliefs to anybody. Mm-hmm. I think he's actually said that. He said, these are our values, ours. I can't deny you the right to do what you want to do at your home, just like you can't deny me the right that I want to do at my home. So it's not as though Russia's trying to impose Russian orthodoxy on the United States. If that was the case, then we'd have a clash. Mm-hmm. What's happening is the United States has a foreign policy that wraps itself in a values-driven campaign, but it's not really a values-driven campaign. It's an economic conflict disguised as values-driven campaign, because we like to lure people in with the allure of our culture. I mean, that's why we showed our movies. I mean, 50 Shades of Grey. I mean, what guy doesn't read that and go, I want some of that, and that's not America. That's just a novel. It doesn't work that way. But the point is, we use our culture as a way of getting into place, and then we demand that you alter your internal dynamic to meet our cultural standards, which are really nothing more than the commercial end of our economic, machine. We want to control you economically. We want to determine what you wear, how you wear, what you eat, drink, etc. It's that kind of control. And I think the Russian president's saying no. It doesn't mean that necessarily all the Russian people agree. In fact, I think there's many Russian people who look at the West and say, I like that. I like that aspect of it, etc. But what they don't probably understand is what they're not recognizing what the American culture actually represents. It's not freedom to wear what you want. It's the tip of a larger spear of American control over your society. And I think that's what Russia's trying to prevent. Because look, I haven't been to Moscow lately. Mm-hmm. I want to go. I'd love to see it. I saw Moscow in the 1980s, early 1990s. The Soviet city at that time. It hadn't undergone the transformation that it's going. But I will bet you a dime to a dollar that if I go to Moscow today, the city I'm going to see is going to be more reflective of Western influence than Russian orthodoxy. That Russia didn't start building. I mean, they refurbished a lot of churches, thank goodness, because I enjoy that part of their culture and their history. But when I walk down Moscow, I'm not going to see, staid Russian orthodoxy, people wearing black cloaks, walking around and nodding sagely at one another. I'm going to see neon lights, flashy lights, big things. It's just like the West. So Russia's not rejecting the West. I think Russia's done a good job of incorporating aspects of the West. But I think Russian cultural values aren't American cultural values. I think Russia has a look. Let's not pretend there's homosexuals in Russia. We know it. Not pretend there aren't. But I think what Russia takes a look at is in the United States how the struggle over homosexual rights has eroded traditional family values, and they take a look at high crime rate. They take a look at falling education standards. They take a look at a society in disarray. And they say we don't want that. What we want is what we got, and what we got appears to be derived from traditional family values. That's what American conservatives are saying here in the United States. Traditional family values. The problem is you can't have traditional family values and treat untraditional cultural realities in an equal fashion, because then you run into this clash of cultures. And you're looking at the United States, we're at war with ourselves. We're literally at war with ourselves because we have people who are espousing traditional husband-wife marriages, clashing with people who believe in same-sex marriage. I still don't understand this pronoun thing, but whatever. And again, when I say that, I'm not being disrespectful. I'm just admitting I don't understand it. Okay, it doesn't mean that I condemn it. I just don't understand it. I guess I'm a he, him kind of guy. My wife is hopefully, I think I would, a she, her kind of gal. We're not confused. We know who we are, and all that. But I will say this: we've raised two daughters who are, they have their own points of view, and sometimes their points of view diverge from the views of their parents, which is fine. They are a reflection of their reality, and I think we did good raising them so that they are open-minded enough to consider all possibilities. But Russia takes a look at that, and remember, America is a country that can afford to be this open. Why? Because we won the Second World War, and we didn't just win it militarily. I know Russia won the war, the Soviet Union won the war. How dare you say that? Fine, but war is just an extension of politics by other means. And which nation emerged globally dominant at the end of the Second World War? And it ain't the Soviet Union. It was the United States because of our economy. And we had two large oceans. Russia will always be surrounded by potential enemies. We have two large oceans with the Canadians, the nicest people in the world to the north, and the Mexicans, another friendly people to the south. We're under threat from nobody. So we're this little island of American, perfection, even though we're not perfect. And therefore, we can afford to be as free and experimental as we want. Russia can't afford to be free and experimental. Russia has to understand that there are people on its borders trying to destroy them. And so Russia has to fall back on that which makes it strong. And what makes it strong is this Orthodox tradition. And that tradition is founded in, a man is a man, a woman is a woman, a family is derived from the union of the two. So I disagree with Mr. Peterson, because I don't view this as a clash. I don't think Russia's trying to impose itself on the United States. And I think that Russia is successfully repelling the American cultural advances. But at the end of the day, to be honest, the average American doesn't really care what goes on around. I mean, there are activists who will say, oh my God, we can't give them aid unless they do the following. I mean, we do that at the United Nations. We recognize the world has a a population growth problem. But we can't give you economic aid unless you ban abortions and you do everything we want you to do. Again, I'm not going to weigh in on abortion, good, bad, or what. It's not my point. My point is we're imposing our values. When I say our values, understand that the American people are not united on their opinion of abortion. So we're imposing the values of those who are political control on other nations in a manner which denies them the opportunity to solve the problems they're facing, like starving to death, things of that nature. They don't really care what America thinks about abortion. They just need the aid. But that's part of the American cultural war, to impose ourselves on you in a manner that exploits our strength and your weakness. And I think one of the interesting things, if you take a look at Russia and Africa today, ask the Africans, why are you talking to the Russians? And are you anti-American? And they say, well, no, we're not anti-American, but we are pro-Russian because the Soviets were the only ones who talked to us back in the day, and they treated us like equals. They didn't come in like a colonial power. They didn't come in like, the American superiority. They came in as Russians, dealing with us as people, as equals, and they still treat us that way today. And I think that's the difference in approach. Russia's not trying to export Russian Orthodoxy. When the Russians travel abroad, they're Russians. They come into a country and they respect that country's way of living. They're not trying to tell the Africans, you must do what we do. You must convert to Orthodoxy. You must speak Russian. You must. No, they just say, what do you need? What can we do for you? What can you do for us? What can we do for you? You're you, we're we, and let's work together in harmony. I think I just made a poem there, but okay, next.
Yes. My next question, who of the historical figures, historical person, would you like to meet, talk to, interview? It could be anyone. Benjamin Franklin, Stalin, Napoleon, Caesar, maybe Vladimir Putin. Please answer.
Well, first and foremost, I would say that from my perspective and what I'm doing today, it would be Vladimir Putin. I think he's one of the most misunderstood people in America. I think today we have a class of people we call the Putin whisperers, who are out there just promulgating mistruths and distortions, or what I believe are mistruths and distortions. I don't know, because Vladimir Putin is one of the most mysterious figures out there. I mean, we know roughly, who he is. We know roughly his biography, but we don't know him as a person, and I think he prefers it that way. I think he prefers to be sort of a aloof leader, because his job is to lead people, not to open his heart and soul to people. So the likelihood of somebody like me ever getting an opportunity to interview Putin on that level is probably slim to none. But I think his story, accurately told, properly told, could go a long way in re-educating the American public about the reality of Russia. Because right now we say, whenever we talk about Russia, it's only one thing. It's Putin, Putin's this, Putin's that, Putin's playbook, Putin did this, Putin did that. But we never talk about the Russian people. We never talk about the Russian government. We never talk about the Russian system. Putin, or Putin and the Solovki. The Solovki. Who are they? The power structure. Who are they? The defense minister and the oligarchs. But I thought Putin didn't like the oligarchs. Yeah, but there's other Solovki too. So we have these two terms, Putin and the Solovki. We have no clue who they are. But to better understand the Solovki and their relationship to power today, because Putin has been the power in Russia for 2 decades. He's going to be the power in Russia for another decade. He's the key to understand him, not because he's the ultimate dictator, but because his relationship with Russian power structures is important. How did he get to be president? I still want to know that question. I want to know how he went from driving a taxi cab in St. Petersburg in 1991 to being the president of Russia in 1999. That story right there, from 1990, 1991 to 1999, is the most important story in the world today, from my perspective. So that would be the one guy I would like to interview. Did you just ask for the one person, right?
My next question is personal question. I really love Jordan Peterson, Rules for Life. Maybe you know. This was a period in my life when I lived by them for 2 years. 1 week, 1 rule. Tell the truth, clean the room, take responsibility, and other rules. This is not just rules for life, but also principles, values, and that are very important. Tell me about your rules of life, values, principles, what you passed on to daughters. Before you answer, it seems to me that one of your principles of life This is words of your wife, Mrs. Marina Ritter, told you in court in Pennsylvania. Hold your hands up high, Scott. Sorry if it's personal
I
question.
mean, she said that. Look, we knew what was happening. We knew what they were trying to do to me. They were trying to destroy me. And a key aspect of destroying me was to try and make me look weak, make me look, disenfranchised, because that's what they wanted. They wanted me to go into a system, be destroyed by that system, and come out and disappear.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, guess what, guys? Didn't work because my wife knows me. Hold my head high, and I did. I went into prison with my head held high. I didn't apologize for anything because I hadn't committed a crime. They want, especially people accused of the crimes that I was accused of. You're supposed to go into prison and disappear because if you come out, they beat you up, they kill you. They do. They literally do. I walked in and said, "This is who I am. Right here. You want a piece of this? Bring it on. I'm not here to hack anybody. I'm just going to get through whatever I have to get through. But I don't apologize for nothing. I'll hide from nobody. I'm here. Deal with it." And they did. The prisoners dealt with it. The guards dealt with it. The warden dealt with it. And I walked out with my head held high, just like I went in with my head held high, and I am who I am. Look, I'm a very proud person. I know that that's one of the 7 deadly sins. But you know what? You got to be proud to survive in a world where people are trying to take you down. There's a price to pay for freedom of speech. I said that there aren't any jackbooted thugs, or there are jackbooted thugs. They do arrest. They do falsify crimes. They do convict you on manufactured cases. They do deny you your appellate rights. And they imprison you and they try to destroy you. They try to kill you. They try to do any number of things. So yeah, there's bad things out there. How do you get through it? Don't let them win. Just don't let them win. Survive and emerge and say, you lost. And that's what I do every day, is I'm staring the judge in the eyes right now. Jennifer Saiboom, I'm looking at you. You lost. I'm staring Michael Rakachevsky, the prosecutor, in the eyes. You lost. I'm staring Veneman, the detective, in the eyes. You lost. Your little conspiracy to destroy Scott Ritter failed. It failed because it was based on a lie, a foundation of untruths. And those untruths will be exposed. But even if they're not exposed, my very existence proves that you failed, because you didn't want me to come out. You wanted me to come out and hide. You wanted me to be ashamed. You wanted me to crawl. I'm ashamed of nothing. I hide from nobody, and I'll crawl before nobody. Is that pride? Yes. But it's an absolute fundamental requirement to survive in this world. I have to confront the world head on. I'm not running from anybody. And even if I wanted to, I'm getting so old right now that I don't know if I could run away very fast. So I have no choice but to stand my ground. But so yeah, that's that. What made me who I am? What do I believe in? One of the great lessons of my life was just watching my parents growing up. My parents, you learn from your parents. And I learned from my mom what it means to be a person that is solely dedicated to raising 4 children in a very complex world. We were military, so we moved all over the place. And one of the places that we lived in was in Maxwell, Alabama, in the late 1960s. And if you know anything about American history, you know that Maxwell, Alabama had a racial problem, meaning the blacks were not treated as humans. The whites were aggressive and all that. Aggressive. They murdered the blacks. They robbed them. They beat them. The cops wouldn't defend them. And watching my parents deal with that in such a noble and responsible way, because my parents viewed it as an opportunity to teach us the values. And look, my parents, they weren't liberals, they were conservatives, but they believed in human dignity, and they believed in human equality. They weren't, abolitionists and all this kind of stuff. They were just people trying to live their lives, and they were seeing a manifest unjust taking place. And they didn't hide it from us. They didn't pretend that it didn't exist. They didn't shield us from it. They said, this is it. This is what's happening. This is why it's important that you treat everybody as a human being, regardless of their skin color, or you treat everybody with dignity. And it's one of the great lessons. Again, I was 7 years old? So I'm learning a heavy lesson in life at the age of 7. and then we learned a lot of other things. Watching my father serve his country and seeing the sacrifice that was called upon my mother. We were raised in Turkey for 2 years. And I have to tell you, to be a teenager in Turkey was just the wildest experience of my life, because it literally was the Wild West. It was chaos, anarchy, everything I wanted, which means it was bad for my mom. I mean, my school bus was chased down by a gunman trying to kill us inside, shooting a gun at us, and we're all inside going, "Whoa, isn't this cool?" It wasn't. Well, it was, but it wasn't. We had tanks on the street. We had soldiers. We had Kurdish rebels. We had the Turkish nationalists. We had all this stuff. And for a teenager, it's just like, this is the coolest thing in the world. And for my mom, it was the most dangerous experience because her kids were at risk. And seeing how she worked to protect us, but not deny us the opportunity to live a full life. It's a lesson in parenting. But the best lesson came when I was in high school, and we had just arrived, and teenagers can be mean. And my sister, some guys were talking about my sister behind her back. I took exception to that, and so I beat them up. Well, I fought them. I think I gave, there were 3 of them, 1 of me. They got some hits in, but I took them down. But the teacher broke it up and sent me down to the principal. And the principal's now, "What do I do with you? You just got in a fight. You can't fight." And he said, "Well, why did you get in a fight?" And they said, "Well, they were saying bad things about my sister." And he said, "Well, was this in relation to a certain incident?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, maybe what they said was true." So I went across the table and I took a swing at him, and I missed him, but I was getting ready to beat him up. My older sister had to pull me off. So he calls my dad. He says, "I got your son here." And I said, "Okay, why are you calling me?" He said, "Well, your son was in a fight." He said, "Okay, why are you calling me?" He said, "Well, the penalty for fight is suspension." He said, "Why are you calling me? Did my son get in a fight?" "Yes." "Is the penalty for fighting suspension?" "Yes." "Then suspend him. Don't waste my time." I'm sitting there going, "I was defending myself." Nope, I was suspended. 3-day suspension, sent home. Then my dad, who knew the story from my sister, because he talked to her, came up and he said, "You probably think I was pretty hard on you." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, let me put it this way. Right now, I'm looking at you and I say, I love you because you did the right thing. You stood up for your sister." He said, "But there is no free ride. Doing the right thing isn't supposed to be easy. You got in a fight. You knew the rules. You broke the rules. You're suspended. That's it." I went, but he said, "If you had done something different, I wouldn't be looking at you like this. I'd be very disappointed in you. But I'm proud of you." Said, "All right, 3-day suspension. Awesome." Woke up the next morning. My dad's getting ready to go to work, and I'm like, 3 days of vacation. I come out, and there's a bucket, there's a mop, there's soap. He says, "I want the car cleaned. I want it vacuumed. I want it polished. I want it shined. When you're done, I need you to do the same to this room." And I said, but he said, 3-day suspension doesn't mean a 3-day vacation. You're going to pay the price. The price of fighting is you're going to, and for 3 days, he worked my ass off, and I finally went back to school. But so that's one of the great lessons in life, is that, you do the right thing, but there's a price to be paid, and you don't get to walk away from not paying the price. That, if you're going to make the decision to do something, you got to pay the price. And one of the best lessons I ever learned was that. So, that I think, that was one of the great experiences. I mean, there's a lot, but I think growing up with such wonderful parents was a great deal. And I tried to impart that on my kids. I remember once, and I don't want to bring up too much about my kids because nobody's damn business, but they were in school, and they had, and I forget the exact circumstances, but they had missed the bus, the school bus, and so now they had to go to the library and wait. And the librarian, or a teacher who was being a librarian aide, asked them why they missed the bus, and they said something. They said, and the librarian basically alluded to that they were lying, that they were making something up. So I went and finally we got the kids, and I brought them home, and they were upset. I said, "What's going on?" Because I told my kids, never lie. That's the whole thing. Never lie. Tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, and take the consequences for it. Believe me, the consequences of telling the truth are never as bad as the consequences of lying. So they said, "Well, somebody called us a liar." I said, "Who?" I said, "Get in the car." And we drove right back to the school, and I went straight into the principal's office. I sat them down. I said, look, your teacher has no right to call them a liar. These are my daughters. I can tell you right now that when they tell me something, it's the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And what they're telling you is the truth. And your person had no right to prejudge them as a liar. And the principal started. I said, no, I'm telling you right now, this is a conversation. It's only going to end one way. And that's with you disciplining the teacher, called them a liar. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about this. And it got so bad that I didn't get violent, but I was raising that the police, the safety officer came in and he's watching that whole thing. I guess he was like, are you going to punch a teacher? No, I'm not going to punch a teacher. I'm just insisting that you don't get to call my kids liars. This is a lesson. This is a life lesson. And so they brought the teacher in. The teacher told the story. And then finally the teacher said, well, I didn't have any evidence that I lied. So therefore, you just presume they lied. Yes. And I said, well, we started to break the story down, and it turned out that everything my kids said was true. And the guy, well, I apologize. I said, well, it's too late. You already called them a liar. Let this be a lesson to you, that you don't prejudge anybody, even if they're kids. And as we're walking out, the cop's like, you did the right thing. But my kids were embarrassed. It took a while for me to explain to them why it was absolutely important that I did that I couldn't let this happen, because once you tolerate somebody calling you a liar, then it breaks down your tolerance for lies. Once it becomes okay, then you just sort of assume that it's part of life. And no, lies can never be told. Lies can never be told. I mean, there's white lies. Honey, does this dress look good? Yes, honey, it looks great. When in fact you're like, no, but I know she likes to dress, therefore I'm going to make her happy. Okay, so I'm not perfect, but a fundamental lie is something that can't be told. And so, but that was something that was taught to me by my parents. Just don't lie. Tell the truth. And when you tell the truth, you will pay the price. You will pay the consequence. But the consequence of telling the truth is always less than the consequence of a lie, because by telling the truth, people trust you. When you tell a lie, people don't trust you. You can't be trusted going down the road. So, that's something that I've tried to impart on them. And then the last thing is just love of country, absolute love of country. And the best way to love your country, I think, is to leave your country for a little bit. So I took my girls around the world with me. I had some unique opportunities of travel, and I brought them with me around the world. They got to see, Asia. They got to see a lot of Europe. They got to see the Caribbean, South America, and all the wonders that accrues with that. But it also made them realize that America is different than the world they're seeing, and they learned to appreciate America more by being away from America. And so I think I taught them not only to be intellectually curious about the world and the wonders of the world and the glories of different cultures, but also when you come home to say, but this is home. I love home. I love what this is. So that was something I tried to do. I think I've succeeded in both counts. They both are well-adjusted girls who are doing quite well in society.
Absolutely. I want you to know that millions of Russians, and not only Russians, citizen Ukraine, citizen Belarus, Kazakhstan, and other countries support and believe you and appreciate your works. And your book, you sent me your book and I read it. I had the answer from you quite recently in an interview, but this is most popular questions that a lot of people have asked to find out if it will be translated into Russians. Yes, it will. Can you tell us more about when and what sales plans are in Russians?
Well, the sales plan's always first of all, we fully intend to have it published in Russian. I'm not in control of the process. I have a partner that I have faith in, who is actively trying to get the book translated. They've hired a team of expert translators, and I guess the goal is.
Not wife, not your wife, translate.
No, she when she comes home, she's tired, and she edits my books, but she's not a translator. But the idea is to capture the accuracy of the emotion of the book, because there's a lot of stories, a lot of humor in the book. There's a lot of tension, difficulty, etc. So you want to capture that. You don't want to translate in a way that it's technically correct, but emotionally vacant. So they're working on that right now to do that. And this takes time. So the first thing that has to happen is they have to complete the translation of the book. Once they get the book completely translated, then they will pick a publisher that is appropriate to the task. And that's a decision they make. And then that publisher has to work with my American publisher, and they have to come up with an arrangement. And when that happens, they will publish the book in Russia. Mm-hmm. And the goal, I can't guarantee the outcome, but the goal is that I would come to Russia and do a book tour. And basically using the book as a vehicle to go out and talk with Russians around the expanse of Russia about the history. Maybe some of them are familiar with it, maybe some aren't. But the biggest thing is to promote dialogue, because right now Russians and Americans aren't talking. We're not. It's not that we're just not talking. We don't trust each other. We don't like each other. We got problems. And so this book isn't just about writing something that you want Russian people to buy and all that stuff. Trust me, as a writer, the more books I sell, the better. But that's not the ultimate objective. The ultimate objective is to create a vehicle of dialogue. So if through this book, I can not only tell my story to Russian people, but through the process, get them to be curious about an American and a shared history, and comfortable with the concept that maybe we could do it again. Maybe somewhere in America today, there's the next Scott Ritter, the next John Sartorius, the next Barrett Haver, the next Stu O'Neill, who can travel, Ann Mortensen, Robin Innes, all these wonderful people who can travel over to Russia and recreate an environment of cooperation in the cause of getting rid of nuclear weapons. Not a bad thing. And maybe over in Russia right now, there's a whole generation of their future inspectors who will do the same thing in the United States and have that same shared experience. But in order to do that, you have to have people believe in that concept. You have to trust that concept. And the best way to do that would be to educate people about the past, when it worked. For one brief shining moment, we had this Camelot type moment where Russians and Americans worked in cooperative fashion to get rid of nuclear weapons. And in the process, we learned a lot about each other. We broke down the barriers of mistrust that are derived from ignorance. We educated one another on the reality, the humanity of each other. And that's what I'd like to accomplish with this book, is a vehicle of dialogue, a vehicle of hope. And so to go around Russia and try and infuse some hope in the potential of Russian-American relations in the future, knowing that what's going on right now is a very difficult time. But I mean, when were you born? I'll just ask you that. What year?
Orenburg.
No, when?
1993.
Okay. So you weren't alive when I was doing my work. And that's the thing. Many people weren't. So there's a period of time, people who lived, right now, I think Russia is full of people who lived in the 1990s, and they know the horror of the 1990s and the difficulties. But there's not as many people around who lived in the 1980s. 1980s were also a very dangerous time between relations between the Soviet Union and the West. We almost went to war a number of times, almost went to nuclear war. We didn't trust each other. You were the evil empire. We were enemy number one, da-da-da-da. So all the people today that are saying things are so bad, we could never work with the Americans. We could never trust the Americans. If they said the same thing in the 1980s when things were just as bad or in many cases worse, we never would have had an INF treaty. We never would have done what we did. So this book is a template of hope. It basically says, as bad as things are, they can get better. Why? Because we proved it once. We showed that it can happen. We showed that the potential's there. So that's why I would really like to be able to do a book tour like that, because not only hopefully would we sell a lot of books, but it would be about, more importantly, I mean, trust me, if I could give the books away for free, I would. But no publisher is going to agree to that. But the thing is, it's the dialogue, and it's two-way too, because I think one of the interesting things that could be done with a book tour of that scope and scale would be to capture it on video, like a documentary, and make a movie, a short documentary movie about that experience, and bring it back to the United States, and then share that experience with the American people. Come in and talk to them about my book and show them the movie of how the book was received by Russians. And maybe something good could happen, because now maybe that community might want to make connection with the Russian community and begin that kind of dialogue. And if I can be the catalyst that make that happen, wow, what a way, what an accomplishment.
It's fantastic news. If I can help sales books in my YouTube channel, I can, absolutely. My favorite chapter, it's Glasnost comes to Watkins. Is one of the best in the book, in my opinion. Glasnost is very clearly visible on the journalists of that time. It seems to me that journalists were better than that journalists are now in Russia. For example, Elvira Bykova from the newspaper Leninsky Pуть. Now it's called Votkinsky Vesti. By the way, I wrote there. I wanted to contact her, Elvira Bykova, but they told me that she had left for Moscow and there were no contacts. Tell me, in 19th, when you had already left Russia, did you work in Iraq? Did you follow what was happening in Russia? Maybe you were talking to someone. If I understand correctly, after Operation Desert Storm, you were going to continue working with Russians, but you were unexpectedly called up to work in Iraq, in United Nations. Maybe I were wrong.
After Desert Storm, well, even prior to Desert Storm, when I came back when I finished the weapons inspection process, understand I had been married. I married out of college, like my college sweetheart, wonderful person, literally. And she knew that I was going into the Marine Corps, but for her, the Marine Corps was an abstraction. Hey, he wears a uniform, he looks good, but the Marine Corps is hard work. And for the first couple of years of our marriage, I was in 29 Palms, and I was in the field training over 220 days a year. And that's difficult. But she soldiered through it fine. Then I got the job in Russia, and I was gone about 230, 240 days a year. And so now we're talking 5 years into this, and she's like, I'm a widow. I mean, I don't have a husband. He's never home. And when I left the job in the Soviet Union, the weapons inspection job, and I think I alluded to it in the book, I had a good reputation. The CIA loved me. Everybody loved me. And they wanted me to do some special work. We call it pager work. Back there before cell phones, we had pagers, and you put the pager on, and then the number goes off. You look at the number, then you go to a cell phone and you call the number, and they tell you what to do, and then you go do it. And you can't tell your wife anything because it's all secret and all that stuff. And for someone like me, it's exciting stuff, man. It's like, yeah, I'll do pager job. I'll do that job. And she's like, no, you won't do that job. You have to decide, do you want to be married to me, or do you want to stay in the Marine Corps? That's a very tough decision to make. And I actually chose to get out of the Marine Corps to try to save the marriage. And my justification for that is I joined the Marine Corps to kill Russians. And now instead I'm working with them, and there's no reason for me to stay in the Marine Corps anymore. But then Saddam invaded Iraq, or invaded Kuwait, and suddenly we were going to go to war. And I went to the Marine Corps and I said, I can't leave the Marine Corps when my country's going to war. You got to use me. Don't disgrace my service. You guys said I was one of the best intelligence officers. Don't disgrace my service by letting me go. And they said, no, come here, boy. And they used me. So I did my war, and that's a different story altogether. But I survived the war. I had a good war. I came out, alive and with a good reputation. But then now with the war over, the Marine Corps, including the commandant, 4-star general, head Marine, kept calling me and saying, you got to stay in the Marine Corps. You had a great war. You know, you're a hero. You got to stay in. You got to do this stuff. I said, I don't want to. I did my service to the country. I'm done with that business. I would prefer now to get back and do things. And I was recruited by a company called H.J. Heinz. You might know them. They make ketchup. They make a lot of things. They make one of the things they do is processed food. And they were looking at putting a processed food facility in Pyatigorsk in southern Russia. And they wanted me to be the manager, to be the guy who did, because I had experience in building a portal monitoring facility in Vodkinsk. And so they're like, well, if you can do that, you can do this. And so that was the job that I was looking to have. But then in August of 1991, literally right as I was starting to finalize my negotiations with H.J. Heinz, there was the coup. And Yeltsin jumps on a tank and the whole thing's unstable. And H.J. Heinz said, we're going to pull out. We're not going to do this. And so now I'm unemployed. And so I'm sitting there in my parents' house. I just got, to make the other things. When I made the decision to go to war, my first wife said, we're done. You chose to stay in the Marine Corps. That was your decision. You chose them over me. So we ended up getting divorced. And then when I got out and all that, one of the things that I was looking to do in Russia was travel and investigate how this would work with H.J. Heinz. And I found out that Marina, who I met in Vodkinsk, but if you read the book, there's, everybody's like, where's the love story? There wasn't a love story. She was a translator. I was an inspector. We met, but that's it. but the love story came later when I said I have to go over to, because in order for me, before I'm an official employee of H.J. Heinz, to do reconnaissance of Pyatigorsk in that area, because I was tasked with bringing material in through Turkey that would go through Georgia up to Pyatigorsk and all this. So I wanted to go look at the roads and look at that's what intelligence officers do. I wanted to see how everything works. But I could either do that with an interest visa, that means I'm controlled now by Soviet authorities, or I could get a sponsor. A sponsor, I can come in under the radar. And so I asked around, I said, Pyatigorsk, that's near Georgia. I called up my friends, hey, anybody know where Marina is? She's still in Vodkinsk? No, she left Vodkinsk. She's home. I'd call up. And to call Sukhumi from, because she lived in Sukhumi, to call Sukhumi from the United States is an adventure in its own right, because you can't call Sukhumi directly. You have to go through at least one, sometimes two operators. So I have to call to get an operator. That's always a challenge. I have to get one that understands me, because my Russian is horrible. Then they connect me to another operator. Then they try to connect me to Marina. So I'll sometimes spend 3 days trying to get the phone call in. Finally, it answered. Yes, Marina, it's Scott Ritter from Vodkinsk. Click. Wait, I just spent 3 months, 3 days trying to call you. Hello, operator. Yes, operator. Yes. Marina, it's Scott Ritter from Click. I wrote a letter. Give me your address. And I wrote a letter. Hey, why are you hanging up? I want to talk to you about, I'm getting out of the Marine Corps and all that. So she's like, finally she answers, she goes, we don't trust you. We know who you were in Vodkinsk. We know what you were in Vodkinsk, and we don't want any part of that. But I'm getting out. It's the new me. I'm a changed man. I'm going to try to be a good citizen. I'm going to get involved in, making baby formula in Pyatigorsk and all this stuff. And I want your family to sponsor me. Click. It took a while. Finally, they agreed to sponsor me. But that discussion was taking place in the fall of 1990. And then I went to war. So one of the great untold stories is, so I'm in Tampa Bay getting trained, getting briefed on all the intelligence stuff and what's going to happen over there. And I'm talking at the highest level, the top secret stuff. But I'd go back to my quarters, and Marina's family had agreed to have me come over in February. But now I'm going to war. So I have to tell them that I can't come. So I'm trying to make a phone call. Same thing, operator. I can't get. All right. So it's time for me to go to war. And because I was an intelligence officer, they hand me this big packet of top secret material and a pistol. I'm the courier. So I got to carry the top secret material and bring it to Saudi Arabia. So on my way to the airplane, duffel bag, top secret material, pistol, these 2 cars pull up. boom, guys jump out. They got their hands on their guns. I'm like, okay, strange. You know, Captain Ritter, yes, come with us. I go over there and they say, we need your weapon. So I give them my weapon. We need your classified material. Give me my classified material. I said, all right. They take me upstairs and they read me my rights. And I'm like, this is serious. What the hell's going on? They said, okay, I know you want to get on an airplane. I know you think you're going to war, but you got to answer some questions first. I said, why were you trying to call Moscow? I said, well, I wasn't. And they're going for the handcuffs. I said, I was trying to call Sukhumi through Tbilisi. They're like, they look at their records. Okay, why were you trying to do that? I said, well, I wanted to get in touch with this family that was going to sponsor me. And, I'm going to war and they expect me to show up and I'm not going to be able to show up. I was getting out of the Marine Corps, but now I'm in the Marine Corps. I've stayed in the Marine Corps, so I have to tell them. How do we know you're telling us the truth? I said, well, because I don't lie. And two, because back when I made the original phone calls, I went to what's called the Special Security Officer, Quantico, Virginia. He's the guy that manages people like me that have high security clearances. And I said, I've been read out of the programs, meaning I'm no longer actively involved in the programs. I don't have access to the intelligence anymore, but I still have the clearances. So I'm duty bound to tell you that I'm getting out and I'd like to make contact with this family for this reason. And I wrote a letter, then he wrote a cover letter and he endorsed it. He said, you have permission to contact this family. I said, so if you call this guy, and I had his number, he'll tell you and they called up, boom, boom, and they're talking to each other and they go, all right, here's your gun back. Here's your classified stuff back. Good luck. You're not a spy, but don't try and call her from Saudi Arabia. They won't understand. So I had to go to war without being able to contact her. It was interesting. But where were we going on this? We were talking about why were we talking about this? We were talking about Elvira. We were talking about Glasnost. How do we
book and
where were we going with this conversation? Anyways, Maureen and I was trying to talk about how Maureen and I got married. Anyways, we got married after the war when I got out. Because we're talking about, well, you mentioned about how did I get called up by the United Nations and did I meet any Russians? That's the point.
Yes.
All right. So Maureen and I got married, and I get a call from Colonel England, who's the book's dedicated to, one of the people, Colonel England, Colonel Connell. And he said, hey, Ritter, what are you doing? I said, nothing. I'm unemployed. I lost my job. I was supposed to go to Russia with H.J. Hines. He said, well, how'd you like to come work for the United Nations? I said, doing what? And he said, well, we need a guy who's good on arms control, who's an intelligence specialist, who knows something about Iraqi systems. You just came back from the war. You were a scud hunter in the war. We want you to come and create an intelligence unit. I said, all right, I'll do that. And long story short, I did it. But in the process, this will be in the book I'm writing right now, if it ever gets approved for publication. I met a guy named Nikita Smitovich, who was a Russian diplomat, on arms control. One of the greatest people I'll ever met in my life. And when I met him, he was a Soviet diplomat. Literally, a few months later, became a Russian diplomat. So we had to deal with that transition. But through him, I did a number of very interesting things. For instance, one of the jobs I had was to investigate what Russia sold to Iraq, what Iraq actually received from the Russians. There's a lot of speculation about did the Russians provide them with this, that, and the other thing. And so the Russians sent a team from Moscow with the archives of the records of all the transactions between the Russian Ministry of Defense Industry, Russian Ministry of Defense, and Iraq. They came with guys from defense industry and a bunch of KGB guys. And they put it down in the basement of the Russian mission to the United Nations. Several times a week, I would go down there and they'd escort me in, and big guys with big necks and big arms standing there looking at me while I open up my pad and I read the documents, write down notes. Then I would bring in the experts and I would ask them questions about what I read, and they'd give me the answers. And I was able to build a very accurate picture of that. That was cooperation with Russian intelligence, the Russian defense. And we had that level of interaction with Russians throughout. I had a Russian officer come and work on teams that I was responsible for. He was a colonel, and he was a guy in the rocket forces, and his specialty was Scuds. He actually took Scud missiles into Afghanistan and trained the Afghan military on how to use Scud. And he was the guy who took Scuds out of East Germany when the Soviet Union collapsed. and he had some experience with guys who trained the Iraqis on Scuds. So he and I worked very closely on trying to get into the mindset of the Iraqis on how they would employ Scud missiles. We brought in fuel experts. We believed that the Iraqis were producing their own fuel and wouldn't know how to do that. So we brought in fuel experts who explained how the two different kind of TG-02 and I forget that's the starter fuel. Then there's a AK-47, which is or 27, which is the nitrate, the oxidizer, and TM 21 or something. That's the fuel, and they broke it all down into the various chemical how it's produced. Then they brought a lab over, and so we had a Russian lab with Russian experts there helping us sample things to determine what it was. I brought in Russian special forces guys who worked with us on certain things. So the answer is I was in constant contact with people, with Russians on a professional level while I was in Iraq. Another story that's never been told until now. We were going to do a very intrusive inspection in August of 1992, and it was going to involve surrounding an Iraqi ministry. And our concern was that the Iraqis would seek to hold us hostage. And we had a lot of American intelligence personnel on the team. The Americans were very paranoid that if the Iraqis held them hostage, that they could gain access to information and all that. So there was an escape plan. And the escape plan involved Delta Force and all this stuff. I won't get into too much, but basically, if we thought we were going to be taken hostage, we were going to be making a run for the desert to predetermined spots. And then if we could outrun the Iraqis, then Delta Force would swoop in, kill all the Iraqis, and rescue us and take us away. And we're looking at that plan going, we're in the middle of Baghdad, don't you? I mean, there's like Iraqis everywhere, and they have radios. So we're running away. They're going to be able to call up guys. And I said, why don't we come up with a better plan? They said, well, what's that better plan? I said, why don't we get the Russian embassy to agree that we can run to them? All we have to do is make it to the Russian embassy. They'll let us in, and then the Russians will protect us until our release can be negotiated. And so we actually built this whole plan, working with the Russian government, where our inspection team would flee to it was Operation Safe Sanctuary, I think it was, Safe Sanctuary. And it was approved by everybody. The Delta Force even planned a rescue mission from the Russian embassy in case the Russians got surrounded and they were coming. It was all sexy, exciting stuff. But the point is, we worked with the Russians nonstop in a very good manner, all the way up until the very end. The Russians were heavily involved in the work of the Special Commission. And in doing so, I got to talk to them a lot about not only the work we were doing in Iraq, but what's going on in Russia itself, the transformation. And it was very hard. I mean, this is in the 1990s, and they're just talking about, one of the things when you worked with the Special Commission, when you came over as a expert on mission, you got a per diem from the United Nations, which they basically gave you enough money to pay for your hotel, buy food, etc. But it was very generous per diem. And some people were making fun of the Russians because they were pooling their money and they were buying necessities of life and having them sit home. And there were people like, oh, the Russians, they're doing this. And I'm like, guys, their families are going through a hell of a time right now. I mean, rather than making fun of them, why don't we ask how we can help them? Maybe there's some things that we can do to minimize their expense. Maybe we can maximize their opportunity. And it was just part of the ignorance that exists in the West towards right. But it was so it wasn't like while I was in Iraq, I didn't have any interaction with Russians. Just the opposite. We had a very in-depth relationship with the Russians, as we did with everybody else. I mean, same things I was doing with the Russians, I was doing with the American CIA, with the people. I was doing it with the British. Me and the Defense Intelligence Service, the British, were very close. I don't know how many red-eye trips I made to London to brief them and get briefed by them. I went to Israel and worked with the Israeli intelligence in a similar fashion. The Jordanian intelligence, the Dutch intelligence, the German intelligence, French intelligence. The relationship between me and France is a very complicated relationship. But the point is that I did stay in contact with Russians, and I was fairly educated about what was going on in the 1990s. My desert, so to speak, in terms of Russia, was after I left the UN and became a private citizen. That contacts stopped, and so I was studying Russia from long distance. I mean, Marina has relatives that live in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and we would interact with them, but it's not on the same level. That's a personal thing as opposed to getting the broader experience of talking to people about the different part of their life. I think I answered your question.
Yes. Two things. Your books. It's one thing. I really searching love story. I really searching love story in this
You
book.
can find it.
And this is funny stories. I like the story of the fish omelets. Most of all, which you are several months because you could not tell the chiefs Galina and Irina the truth. They are very terrible.
Well, it's not their fault. They when we arrived in Vodkensk, the treaty required us to have a facility outside the factory where our housing would be, and part of that facility, because we're Americans, we would have our own kitchen, and we would bring in our own food all the way from Europe and all this kind of stuff. But until that was built, we had to survive on the economy. And so what they did is the factory, Department 162, was the factory department that was responsible for facilitating the INF Treaty. They signed a contract with a local restaurant called the Cafe Cosmos. Mm-hmm. And they had this wonderful staff, Irina and Galina, and they had wonderful cooks. And early on, there was sufficient food of sufficient quantity and quality so that Americans, because they tried to do their best to cook what Americans would eat. Yeah, I'll say Americans, we can be pretty finicky. Sometimes we forget that we're in a foreign country and we want everything to be to our standard and all this stuff, but they tried their best and they cooked omelets, meat omelets. They had good meat and good eggs and everything. They cooked that up. But then the problems with supply chain kicked in, and there were a period of time where they just didn't get the meat. So they had a lot of eggs, and they're figuring out, well, what can we make? And Russians love something called uka, fish soup, fish stew, whatever. To this day, I can't eat it, but but they would basically, they had the ingredients for uka. And so they're like, well, why don't we take the uka and we'll take the fish and we'll put it in the omelet so they have meat. We'll make a fish omelet. It smells and tastes as bad as it sounds. Now, if you're a fan of uka, you will love it. But we came in there and they're bringing out the fish omelets, and the Americans, being the cultural cavemen that they are, went, oh, I can't eat this. And, there wasn't any amount of ketchup they could put on to make it edible. And I'm looking at it, and you can just see that Galina and Irina, they're crushed because they're trying to do their jobs. And their jobs were to make the Americans happy. And clearly the Americans aren't happy. And I'm like, oh, my. So they brought the fish omelet out to me, and it's weeks. You're just like, oh, no. But I'm like, Очень вкусно. And I eat the whole thing. I'm like, this is great. Спасибо, большое спасибо. Можно еще один? Я очень голоден. Like, правда. Another fish omelet. I'm like, and I'd eat 2, 3 in a sitting. They just loved me. I'd come in. Well, then the shipment comes in of all the real meat. And the Americans are once again happy because now we're getting real omelets with real meat and real cheese. And it's just like, and I'm like, thank goodness I can get back to eating a real omelet. And so I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden they bring out a darn fish omelet. And I'm like, what? And they're like, well, we know you love this so much that we prepared it specially for you. And so I had to eat the fish omelet again right there. And then later on, and I never told them. I told the other Americans, they were just laughing at me. Later on, we have an event, the open house. I discussed that. And I don't want to get into it because that's a separate story altogether. But Galina and Irina helped us out because we had a food crisis. We didn't have enough food to support the guests that were coming. So they helped us out, produced a wonderful table of, I think it's called zakuski, the hors d'oeuvres, and they helped prepare the food. And I was so busy that I didn't get to eat any of the food that was prepared. So when I was done, I came into the kitchen. I was looking to find something, and suddenly the American chef, Chuck Biasotti, comes out. And I think it was Galina or Irina, one of the two were there. And I said, I'm hungry. And they come down, they bring some food out. They bring out a fish omelet. I'm like, and I'm like, oh, but they did it as a joke because Chuck had told them the story. So I'm getting ready to eat the fish omelet, and they're like, no, we know the story. And I said, no. And I ate it. I said, it's good because it represented friendship. It represented, I mean, it was a bond. It showed respect for humanity, respect for each other, and all that kind of stuff. It tasted horrible, but it was literally the best meal because of what it represented as opposed to how it tastes.
Yes. In this book, many funny stories, and you can buy book on Amazon, Clarity Press, Barnes and Nobles, and ScottRitterExtra.com, and soon Russian language. Thank you, sir. And simple, short last question, quickly. I sent you some photos from Moscow. This is underground parking lot of one of the houses in Moscow, and it was turned into a bomb shelter. This is water, this is medicine, chairs. Why do you think this should be done? This is common practice, or should we start to be afraid of something?
I'll say this, that every country has a duty and responsibility to protect its citizens. And Russia, like other countries, has a civil defense plan. Now, most civil defense plans have identified locations as bomb shelters in case of a nuclear conflict or a dirty bomb being used, etc. And those bomb shelters, the shelters have to be equipped or else they're useless. If you don't, why put 1,000 people down there and you don't have any water? They're all going to die of thirst. Why put 1,000 people down there who potentially could be injured and not have any medicine? Why put them down there with no place to sit? Why put them down there with no food? And I think what happened with the partial mobilization is that the Russians found that that while the authorities may order something to be done, it wasn't necessarily being done. And then there had not been sufficient follow-up to ensure that an order was given, was it carried out? And I think they identified several problems. And one of the problems might have been that Russia that the authorities hadn't followed through, and that the civil defense infrastructure for Moscow and other cities maybe wasn't where it needed to be. And so what you might be seeing right there is the authorities trying to rectify that error to make sure that if they're going to say there's a bomb shelter, that the bomb shelter can actually function as a bomb shelter. I wouldn't panic about it. I would just say that it's the authorities doing that which is required of authorities to protect the people from any potential threat.
Mr. Ritter, thank you so much. I never used bad words in my speech, in my life, on my channel. But today, I just want to say, may you and we have everything is заебись.
That's another story. I think we have to explain that one before we, because people say that's a horrible word.
No.
But I didn't know it was. I was
reading this book.
Okay, we'll leave it for the book.
Yes,
that's a story in the book. It's actually a pretty funny story, and it plays throughout the book. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. Have a good day.
Thank you.